The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, where Victorian brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder like silent sentinels of wealth and privilege. Officer Brian Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he sipped his now lukewarm coffee. The morning had been quiet, too quiet for his liking, until his radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we have a report of a suspicious person on Chestnut Street. Caller states an unknown male is taking photographs of houses and acting suspiciously. Please investigate. Wilson straightened in his seat, setting down his coffee. This was exactly the kind of call he'd been waiting for. In his 15 years on the force, he'd developed what he considered a sixth sense about these situations. The wealthy residents of Beacon Hill were quick to report anything out of the ordinary, and Wilson took pride in keeping their neighborhood safe. As he turned onto Chestnut Street, he immediately spotted the subject of the call. A black man in his mid-30s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Wilson's monthly salary, was standing on the sidewalk. He held his phone up, carefully photographing the facade of one of the multi-million-dollar homes. Wilson's jaw tightened. Something about this didn't sit right with him. Sure, the man was well-dressed, but in Wilson's experience, that didn't mean anything. Criminals these days were getting smarter, more sophisticated. They knew how to blend in. He pulled his patrol car to a stop and watched for a moment. The man moved with purpose, taking photos from different angles, occasionally making notes on his phone. To an untrained eye, he might have looked like a real estate agent or an architect. But Wilson wasn't buying it. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Leaves skidded across the sidewalk as Wilson approached, his boots clicking against the brick pathway. "Sir," Wilson called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority he'd perfected over years of service. "What exactly are you doing here?" The man turned, lowering his phone. His expression remained neutral, professional, though a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he'd been through similar encounters before. "Good morning, officer," he replied, his voice steady and educated. "I'm conducting an investigation into." "I'm going to need to see some identification," Wilson cut him off, closing the distance between them with measured steps. He positioned himself at an angle that gave him a tactical advantage, his right hand resting casually near his utility belt. The man's eyes tracked Wilson's movement, noting the officer's stance with what seemed like professional interest. "Of course," he said, moving his hand slowly toward his inner jacket pocket. "But first, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Wilson felt his irritation rise. In his experience, only people with something to hide asked questions instead of simply complying. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Multiple break-ins over the past month. Now, ID, please." A jogger slowed her pace as she passed by, shooting curious glances their way. The man noticed this too, his expression remaining carefully composed. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm also doing mine. If you'd allow me to explain." "ID first," Wilson insisted, his voice growing harder. "Explanations later." The morning traffic continued its steady flow behind them, the occasional horn honk punctuating the tense atmosphere. A couple of construction workers across the street had stopped their work to watch the scene unfold. The well-dressed man seemed to make a decision. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, maintaining eye contact with Wilson. "I want to be clear that I'm complying, but I'm also registering my objection to this stop. There's no reasonable suspicion to justify." "Sir, if you don't produce identification immediately, we're going to have a problem," Wilson interrupted, taking a step closer. His patience was wearing thin. Something about this man's calm confidence, his educated manner of speaking, rubbed Wilson the wrong way. In his mind, this had gone from a routine stop to something more suspicious. A light breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells. The man's fingers closed around something in his pocket, but he paused, looking directly at Wilson. "Officer," he said quietly, "I think we both know why I've been stopped. And I want you to think very carefully about your next actions. They could have significant consequences for your career." Wilson felt heat rise in his neck. Was that a threat? He'd dealt with plenty of people who tried to intimidate him with complaints of harassment or discrimination. He wasn't about to back down now. "Step away from the building and place your hands on the wall," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Now." The man shook his head slightly, a look of resignation crossing his features. "Officer Wilson," he said, reading the name tag on the uniform. "I'm going to reach into my pocket very slowly and show you my credentials. I strongly suggest you pay close attention to what I'm about to show you." Wilson's hand moved closer to his weapon, his muscles tensing. The morning had started so quietly, but now he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with confrontation. Whatever this man was reaching for, Wilson was prepared for anything. Or so he thought. As the man's hand emerged from his pocket, Wilson caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach drop. The morning sun glinted off a golden badge, and beneath it, clear as day, were 3 letters that would change everything about this encounter. But that revelation would have to wait for part 2 of this story, as the situation was about to become far more complicated than Officer Wilson could have possibly imagined. The tension in the air was palpable, held in perfect suspension like a drop of water about to fall. Both men stood their ground, each knowing that the next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would ripple far beyond this quiet street in Boston's most prestigious neighborhood. The golden badge caught the morning light, but Officer Wilson wasn't about to let his guard down. In his experience, anyone could get their hands on a fake badge these days. The man's composed demeanor only made Wilson more suspicious. Criminals were getting better at playing roles, at appearing legitimate. "Place it on the ground and step back," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. A small crowd had begun to gather, neighborhood residents pausing their morning routines to watch the scene unfold. Someone had their phone out, recording. "Officer Wilson," the man said calmly, "I'm going to place my credentials on the ground, but I want you to understand that you're making a serious mistake. I'm a federal agent conducting an official investigation." Wilson's jaw clenched. The man's tone, confident, almost condescending, struck a nerve. "On the ground. Now." The man slowly bent down, placing his badge and ID holder on the sidewalk. As he straightened up, Wilson noticed something that made his pulse quicken, a slight bulge under the man's left arm that could only be a shoulder holster. "Hands where I can see them," Wilson barked, drawing his weapon. "Turn around and face the wall." The growing crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "This isn't right." But Wilson tuned them out, focused entirely on what he perceived as a threat. The man raised his hands slowly but didn't turn around. "Officer Wilson, I need you to listen carefully. My name is Special Agent Thomas Henderson. I'm with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The weapon you've noticed is my service weapon, and I'm legally authorized to carry it. If you check my credentials on the ground, you'll find everything in order." Wilson's partner, Officer Rivera, pulled up in another patrol car, lights flashing. The situation was escalating quickly, drawing more attention than Wilson had anticipated. Rivera stepped out, assessed the scene, and approached cautiously. "What's the situation?" Rivera asked, keeping his voice low. "Claims he's FBI," Wilson replied, not lowering his weapon. "Could be armed." Rivera, a 20-year veteran who'd seen just about everything the job could throw at him, picked up the credentials from the ground. He studied them carefully, then pulled out his phone. The man, who claimed to be Agent Henderson, remained perfectly still, hands raised. "Officer Rivera, if you call the Boston FBI field office, they'll confirm my identity. Ask for Assistant Director Chen." Rivera was already dialing. The crowd had grown larger, with more phones recording the incident. Wilson felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Something about this situation felt increasingly wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. The next few minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Rivera spoke quietly into his phone, his expression changing from professional concern to something that made Wilson's stomach sink, recognition and alarm. "Brian," Rivera said quietly, using Wilson's first name, "stand down. He's legitimate. This is a federal agent." But Wilson hesitated. How do we know those credentials aren't fake? That call could have been to anyone. The man who'd identified himself as Agent Henderson spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. "Officer Wilson, your partner has verified my identity. I'm now giving you a direct order to stand down. Every second you keep your weapon trained on a federal agent is another violation we'll have to address." Rivera stepped closer to Wilson. "Brian, don't make this worse than it already is. Look at his credentials yourself." The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl as drivers rubbernecked to see what was happening. The crowd of onlookers had grown to at least 20 people, their murmurs creating a background hum of disapproval. Finally, Wilson lowered his weapon. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash and the dawning realization that he'd made a massive mistake. Agent Henderson lowered his hands and turned around slowly. His face remained professional, but his eyes held a mixture of anger and determination that made Wilson want to look away. "Officer Wilson," Henderson said, his voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority, "I'm going to retrieve my credentials and my phone. Then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what just happened here. Officer Rivera, I'd appreciate it if you'd call your watch commander. We're going to need supervision on scene." Rivera was already making the call. Wilson felt like he was watching the scene from outside his body as Henderson picked up his belongings. The agent brushed some dirt off his expensive suit, straightened his tie, and fixed Wilson with a steady gaze. "While we wait," Henderson said, "I'm going to explain exactly why I'm here. This neighborhood has been the target of a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme. Criminals have been using stolen identities to take out massive mortgages on these properties. I was photographing certain houses as part of our ongoing investigation, an investigation that you've now compromised by creating this scene." Wilson's face burned with shame. The crowd was thinning out, but he knew the damage was done. In an age of social media, this incident would be all over the internet within hours. A supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing. Captain Walsh, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, stepped out and surveyed the scene. Her expression told Wilson everything he needed to know about his immediate future. "Captain," Henderson greeted her, "I believe we need to have a discussion about proper procedure and racial profiling in your department. But first, I'd like to finish documenting the properties I came here to investigate. Officer Wilson is going to assist me by providing security while I complete my work, from a respectful distance, of course." Walsh nodded grimly. "Of course, Agent Henderson. Officer Wilson, you'll comply with the agent's requests and then report directly to my office. Officer Rivera, please stay on scene as well." The morning sun was higher now, erasing the last shadows from the street. Wilson watched as Henderson returned to his work, professionally photographing the houses as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened, and Wilson knew his career would never be the same. As Henderson moved down the street, Walsh pulled Wilson aside. Her voice was low but intense. "When this is done, we're going to have a long conversation about judgment, about bias, and about what it means to wear that badge. I hope you're ready for what comes next." Wilson nodded numbly, watching Henderson work. The agent moved with purpose, his earlier confrontation apparently forgotten as he focused on his investigation, but Wilson knew better. This morning's events would have consequences that would ripple far beyond this quiet street in Boston. The story was far from over, but its direction had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine call about a suspicious person had become something much more significant, a moment that would force not just Wilson, but his entire department to confront uncomfortable truths about policing, privilege, and power. The rest of the morning unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare for Officer Wilson. As Agent Henderson methodically documented the properties for his investigation, Wilson stood at his assigned post, acutely aware of the occasional passers-by who recognized him from the earlier confrontation. Some shook their heads. Others pulled out their phones, no doubt checking if the videos of the incident had already hit social media. Captain Walsh had stationed herself nearby, speaking in hushed tones on her phone. From the fragments of conversation Wilson could hear, the department's public relations team was already scrambling to get ahead of the story. Words like training, review, and statement drifted across the morning air. Officer Rivera maintained his position at the other end of the street, professionally directing traffic around the FBI agent's activities. But Wilson caught his partner shooting him concerned glances. They'd worked together for 3 years, and this was the first time Rivera had seen him lose control of a situation so completely. Around mid-morning, Henderson finished his documentation and approached Wilson directly. The agent's face remained neutral, but his eyes held a mixture of authority and determination that made Wilson's stomach clench. "Officer," Henderson said, his voice measured, "I think it's time we discuss what happened here. Captain Walsh, would you join us, please?" Walsh ended her phone call and walked over. The three of them moved away from the street, finding a quiet spot near a small coffee shop that had become an impromptu observation post for curious onlookers. "Before we begin," Henderson said, pulling out his phone, "I should inform you that videos of our encounter are already circulating online. My office has counted at least 6 different angles of you drawing your weapon on a federal agent. The social media response is significant." Wilson felt the blood drain from his face. Walsh's expression hardened as she pulled up something on her own phone. The hashtag Beacon Hill Cup was trending. "Here's what's going to happen next," Henderson continued. "I'm going to complete my investigation into the real estate fraud ring. Your actions this morning may have compromised parts of our operation, but that's a separate issue. Right now, we need to address the immediate situation." A barista came out of the coffee shop, offering them coffee in what seemed like an attempt to diffuse the tension. Henderson accepted graciously, but Wilson's hands were shaking too much to hold a cup. "The FBI isn't interested in pursuing federal charges," Henderson said after taking a sip. "That would only serve to distract from our primary investigation. However, this incident requires a meaningful response." Walsh nodded. "Officer Wilson will be placed on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. We'll also be conducting a department-wide review of our training procedures." "That's a start," Henderson agreed, "but not enough. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about systemic issues that need to be addressed." As if on cue, Wilson's phone buzzed with a news alert. A local station had already picked up the story. The headline made his heart sink. "Boston police officer draws weapon on FBI agent in affluent neighborhood." "I'd like to propose something constructive," Henderson said, setting down his coffee. "The FBI's Civil Rights Division offers training programs for local law enforcement. Instead of just punitive measures, we could use this incident as a catalyst for real change." Walsh leaned forward, interested. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A comprehensive training program, starting with your department but potentially expanding to others in the region. We focus on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and proper procedure when encountering federal agents in the field." Officer Wilson's experience becomes a teaching tool. Wilson found his voice for the first time since the conversation began. "You want me to, what? Stand up in front of other officers and talk about how I messed up?" "I want you to be part of the solution," Henderson replied firmly. "This morning, you made assumptions based on appearance that led you to nearly shoot a federal agent. That's a powerful lesson, but only if we use it correctly." The morning crowd had thinned out, leaving them in relative privacy. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and coffee. Wilson realized he was at a crossroads. This moment would either define or destroy his career. The training program would be mandatory for all officers, Walsh added, warming to the idea. "We'd need to coordinate with the union, but given the circumstances, I think they'll be cooperative." Henderson pulled out a business card and handed it to Walsh. "My office will send over a formal proposal. In the meantime, Officer Wilson, I suggest you take some time to reflect on today's events. Think about what you could have done differently, what assumptions led to your actions, and how you can use this experience to help other officers avoid similar mistakes." Wilson nodded numbly, watching as his captain and the FBI agent discussed logistics. His mind wandered to the morning's events, playing them back in excruciating detail. Every decision, every word, every action that had led to this moment seemed painfully clear in hindsight. The story would hit the evening news. His family would see it. His friends would see it. His entire world was about to change, all because of a series of assumptions and split-second decisions on what had started as a routine morning patrol. As Henderson prepared to leave, he turned back to Wilson one last time. "Officer, today could have ended very differently. Instead of letting it destroy your career, use it as an opportunity to make real change. Sometimes our biggest mistakes become our most valuable teaching moments." With that, the FBI agent walked away, leaving Wilson to contemplate a future that looked very different from anything he had imagined when he put on his badge that morning. The sun had fully risen now, casting harsh light on a day that would mark a turning point not just for one officer, but for an entire department grappling with issues that could no longer be ignored. The real work, the hard work of change and redemption, was just beginning. Part 4 would bring new challenges, as the consequences of this morning's actions rippled out through the department and the community at large. The next few days passed in a blur for Officer Wilson. Sitting at his kitchen table, he stared at the stack of newspapers, each featuring variations of the same story. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from fellow officers, family members, and even old friends who'd seen the news. He'd stopped checking social media altogether after seeing his face plastered across multiple platforms. The department's internal affairs team had already conducted 3 separate interviews, each one more grueling than the last. They'd gone through every second of the incident, examining his body camera footage, dashboard camera recordings, and the multiple civilian videos that had surfaced online. His wife sat across from him, reading the latest article about the incident. "They're saying Agent Henderson was investigating a multi-million-dollar fraud ring," she said quietly. The criminals were using stolen identities to take out massive mortgages. His team had been tracking them for months. Wilson rubbed his temples. Every new detail made him feel worse. Not only had he drawn his weapon on a federal agent, but he potentially compromised a major investigation. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his eagerness to protect the neighborhood, he'd interfered with someone trying to do exactly that. The doorbell rang, making them both jump. His wife went to answer it, returning moments later with Captain Walsh. "Officer Wilson," Walsh said, taking a seat at the table. "We need to discuss what happens next." Wilson straightened up, noting the formal tone. "Yes, Captain." "The good news is that Agent Henderson has been true to his word. The FBI isn't pursuing charges. The bad news," she pulled out a tablet, showing him a news website. "This story isn't going away. It's become part of a larger conversation about policing practices." The article showed side-by-side photos, Wilson pointing his weapon and Henderson displaying his FBI credentials. The contrast was stark and damning. "The department is implementing immediate changes," Walsh continued. "All officers will undergo mandatory bias training. But here's where you come in. Agent Henderson has proposed something specific for you." Wilson's stomach tightened. "What kind of proposal?" "He wants you to work with him. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is developing a new training program using your incident as a case study. They want you to be part of it." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Wilson's wife reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Why me?" Wilson asked finally. "Why not just use the video footage?" Walsh leaned forward. "Because real change doesn't come from watching videos. It comes from hearing someone say, 'I made this mistake, and here's what I learned.' Agent Henderson believes your experience could help prevent similar incidents." Wilson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his quiet suburban street. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway across the road, their laughter carrying through the glass. It seemed surreal that his world had changed so dramatically while everything else remained normal. "What exactly would this involve?" he asked, turning back to Walsh. 6 months of working with the FBI's training division. You'd help develop the program, share your perspective, and eventually lead sessions with other officers. It's not punishment, it's a chance to make something positive out of this situation. His wife spoke up. Would this affect his position with the department? Walsh shook her head. He'd remain on administrative leave during the program, but this could be his path back to active duty. The department is willing to view this as rehabilitative rather than punitive, provided he fully commits to the process. Wilson returned to his seat, picking up one of the newspapers. His own face stared back at him from the front page, captured in a moment of anger and fear that now seemed foreign to him. "There's something else," Walsh added, her voice softening slightly. "Agent Henderson specifically requested you for this program. He believes you have the potential to help change the culture of law enforcement. He saw something in you, even after what happened." The weight of the opportunity settled over Wilson. This wasn't just about saving his career, it was about preventing other officers from making the same mistakes, about contributing to necessary change in a profession he dedicated his life to. "When would it start?" he asked. "Next week. The FBI wants to move quickly while the incident is still relevant. You'd be working directly with their training division, helping them understand the mindset that led to your actions. Wilson looked at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. What about the media attention? Won't this just keep the story alive? The story is already alive, Walsh replied. The question is whether you want to be part of shaping its ending. Outside, the basketball game had ended. The street was quiet now, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Wilson thought about all the times he'd patrolled streets like this one, about all the split-second decisions he'd made, about the assumptions that had guided those decisions. I'll do it, he said finally. But I want to do it right. No sugarcoating what happened. If we're going to use this as a teaching moment, we need to be honest about everything. Walsh nodded, pulling out some paperwork. Agent Henderson will be pleased. He's already started outlining the program. The first session is scheduled for next Tuesday. As Walsh laid out the details, Wilson felt something he hadn't experienced since the incident: hope, not just for his career, but for the possibility of creating meaningful change. The next few months would be challenging, but they might also be the most important of his professional life. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the FBI training facility as Wilson adjusted his tie for the third time. Through the window of the preparation room, he could see officers filing into the large conference hall. His first training session was about to begin, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Agent Henderson walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Nervous? He asked, offering one to Wilson. These are my colleagues, Wilson replied, accepting the cup. People I've worked with for years. Now I'm supposed to stand up there and tell them about the biggest mistake of my career. That's exactly why this will work, Henderson said, checking his watch. They know you. They respect you. And they know this could have happened to any of them. The past week had been intense. Wilson had spent hours with FBI training specialists, breaking down every moment of the incident. They'd analyzed his body language, his tone, his assumptions. It had been uncomfortable, but necessary. 5 minutes, called a training coordinator, poking her head into the room. Wilson stood up and walked to a small mirror on the wall. His uniform, which he'd been allowed to wear for this session, felt somehow different now. The badge that had once been a source of pure pride now carried a weight of responsibility he'd never fully appreciated before. Remember, Henderson said, just tell it like it happened. No defensiveness, no excuses. Let them see the humanity in the situation. The conference hall was packed. Wilson recognized faces from his own precinct, but there were officers from other districts too. News of the training had spread, and departments across the state had sent representatives. As Wilson stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. His throat felt dry despite the coffee. The podium seemed miles away. Good morning, he began, his voice shakier than he'd hoped. Most of you know me. Some of you have worked with me. And by now, all of you have probably seen the video of me making the biggest mistake of my career. The silence in the room deepened. Wilson could feel every eye on him. But I'm not here to defend what I did. I'm here to help make sure none of you ever find yourself in the same situation. He clicked a button, and the now familiar footage played on the large screen behind him. Watching himself draw his weapon on Agent Henderson still made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to face it. Look at my body language, he continued, pausing the video. See how I approached the situation with my mind already made up? I wasn't investigating. I was confirming my own bias. A young officer in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Wilson recognized the movement. He'd made the same gesture during his own training years ago, when faced with uncomfortable truths. We all have biases, he said, making eye contact with various officers in the room. The dangerous ones aren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes they're hidden in what we think of as experience or instinct. He played more of the footage, stopping at key moments to break down his decisions. When he reached the part where he drew his weapon, an older sergeant in the back raised his hand. Given the information you had, the sergeant said, many of us might have done the same thing. Wilson nodded. That's exactly the problem. We've normalized certain responses based on incomplete information. We call it officer safety, but sometimes it's just fear wearing a badge. The room stirred at that statement. Henderson, watching from the side, gave a slight nod of approval. Agent Henderson could have pressed charges, Wilson continued. He could have ended my career. Instead, he saw an opportunity for change. Not just for me, but for all of us. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about similar incidents across the country. These numbers tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story. They don't show the impact on communities, on trust, on the very nature of what we're supposed to be doing out there. For the next hour, Wilson led the officers through a detailed analysis of the incident. He shared the thoughts that had run through his mind, the assumptions he'd made, the moments where a different choice could have changed everything. Near the end of the session, a female officer raised her hand. "How do you deal with the fear?" she asked. "We're taught to be cautious, to expect the worst. How do we balance that with not letting bias control our actions?" Wilson paused, considering the question. It was something he'd struggled with during his preparation for this training. "The fear doesn't go away," he answered honestly. "But we can choose how we respond to it. That morning, I let fear make my decisions. I stopped being a peace officer and became something else, something none of us should want to be." As the session wrapped up, officers began approaching him. Some shared similar experiences. Others asked questions about specific situations they'd faced. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. Henderson joined him as the last officers filed out. "You did well," he said, "especially handling that question about fear. That's the heart of it, isn't all?" Wilson nodded, gathering his materials. "I keep thinking about how differently it could have ended. One wrong move, one misunderstanding." "That's why we're here," Henderson replied. "That's why this matters." As they walked out of the training facility, the late afternoon sun was setting. Wilson's phone showed several messages from other departments requesting similar training sessions. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. "Ready for tomorrow's session?" Henderson asked as they reached the parking lot. Wilson looked back at the building, thinking about all the officers who would come through those doors in the coming months. Each one carrying their own experiences, their own biases, their own fears. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." 3 months into the training program, Wilson sat in the break room of the FBI field office, reviewing feedback forms from his latest session. The wall-mounted TV was showing a news report about police reform, and he couldn't help but notice how different these conversations felt now compared to when the incident first happened. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife with a link to an article. "Police training program shows promising results," read the headline. The story featured interviews with officers who'd gone through the program, describing how it had changed their approach to daily patrol work. Agent Henderson walked in, carrying a thick folder. "Ready for some good news?" he asked, setting the folder down. "The preliminary data from the departments that implemented our training shows a 40% reduction in escalated encounters." Wilson picked up the folder, flipping through pages of statistics and officer feedback. "These numbers, they're real." "Very real," Henderson replied, pouring himself coffee. "Your story resonated more than we expected. Officers are actually listening, actually changing how they approach situations." The break room door opened as Captain Walsh entered. She'd become a regular visitor to the training sessions, helping coordinate between departments. "We just got approval to expand the program statewide," she announced. "Every police academy in Massachusetts will incorporate this training into their curriculum." Wilson leaned back in his chair, processing the news. What had started as his personal nightmare had evolved into something far bigger than himself. "There's more," Walsh continued. "The governor's office called. They want to use our program as a model for other states. They're calling it the Beacon Hill Initiative." The irony of the name wasn't lost on Wilson. The very location where he'd made his career-altering mistake was now becoming synonymous with positive change. "We've also had requests from community groups," Henderson added. "They want to be part of the dialogue. They're suggesting joint training sessions, officers and community members learning together." Wilson remembered his latest training session from the previous day. An older officer had approached him afterward, sharing how the program had made him rethink an encounter he'd had just that week. "I was about to approach this situation the old way," the officer had said. "But I heard your voice in my head, remembered what you taught us. I slowed down, asked questions first. Turned out the guy was a retired detective working private security. Could have been another incident, but instead, we ended up sharing coffee and war stories." The TV in the break room switched to footage from Wilson's infamous encounter. He no longer flinched when he saw it. The moment had become less about his personal failure and more about the change it had sparked. "The FBI's Civil Rights Division wants to interview you," Henderson said, interrupting Wilson's thoughts. "They're doing a documentary about transformative moments in law enforcement. Your story would be the centerpiece." Walsh nodded encouragingly. "Think about it. Your experience could reach departments across the country." Wilson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Police cruisers moved through the streets, each officer inside making countless decisions that could change lives in an instant. "Remember what you told me that first day?" he asked Henderson. "About using this as a teaching moment." Henderson smiled. "You've done more than that. You've turned it into a movement." The door opened again as more officers arrived for the afternoon training session. Wilson recognized some faces from other departments, but there were new ones too. The word was spreading. "We're getting requests from police unions now," Walsh added. "They want to be proactive, get ahead of these issues before they happen. Your story showed them it's better to address these things openly than wait for the next incident." Wilson gathered his materials for the upcoming session. The nervous energy he'd felt those first few weeks had been replaced by a sense of purpose. Each training session felt less like a confession and more like a conversation about real change. "Today's group includes some senior officers," Henderson mentioned. 20-plus years on the force. They specifically requested to be here. That was new. Early on, the veteran officers had been the most resistant to the training. Now they were volunteering for it. As Wilson prepared to head to the training room, his phone buzzed again. Another message from his wife, a photo of their daughter's school project. She'd written about her dad, not about his mistake, but about how he was helping make police work better. "You know what the best part is?" Wilson said, showing the photo to Henderson and Walsh. "It's not just about preventing bad situations anymore. It's about creating good ones. Every officer who goes through this training has the chance to write a different story." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows as Wilson headed to the training room. The chairs were filled with officers, each carrying their own experiences, their own potential for change. As he approached the podium, Wilson felt the weight of his badge, not as a burden anymore, but as a reminder of the responsibility they all shared. The next chapter of this story would reach beyond Boston, beyond Massachusetts, touching lives in ways none of them could have predicted that morning on Beacon Hill. 1 year after the incident, Wilson stood at the entrance of the National Law Enforcement Training Center in Washington, D.C. The building looked different from the last time he'd visited. New banners hung in the lobby, promoting the nationwide rollout of the Beacon Hill Initiative. Ready for the big day? Agent Henderson appeared beside him, dressed in a crisp suit for the occasion. Today marked the official launch of the national program. Police chiefs, federal officials, and community leaders from across the country had gathered to witness what began as one officer's mistake transform into a blueprint for change. Inside the main conference hall, Wilson spotted familiar faces. Captain Walsh was chatting with officials from other states. His wife sat in the front row, their daughter beside her, drawing in a notebook. Even some of the residents from Beacon Hill had come to show their support. The Attorney General stepped up to the podium. "A year ago," she began, "an incident in Boston could have become just another headline, just another statistic. Instead, it became a catalyst for one of the most significant reforms in modern law enforcement." Wilson listened as she detailed the program's success: reduced incidents of escalation, improved community relations, better outcomes in potentially volatile situations, numbers and statistics that represented real changes in real lives. A video screen behind the podium showed clips from training sessions across the country. Officers sharing their experiences, community members participating in joint exercises, real situations where the new approaches had made a difference. "Officer Wilson," the Attorney General called, "would you join me at the podium?" Walking to the stage, Wilson remembered his first training session, how his hands had shaken, how difficult it had been to face his colleagues. Now, addressing a national audience felt natural, necessary. "When I drew my weapon that morning," he began, "I thought I was protecting my community. What I didn't realize was that my actions were part of a larger problem, one that required all of us to rethink what protection really means." The room fell silent, hanging on his words. Even the most veteran officers leaned forward in their seats. "This program isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," It's about recognition, recognizing our biases, our fears, our potential to do better. Every officer who's gone through this training has their own story of a moment when they chose differently because of what they learned. He shared some of these stories: the rookie officer who de-escalated a tense traffic stop, the veteran sergeant who rebuilt trust in a troubled neighborhood, the detective who recognized his own biases before they could impact an investigation. But the real success stories, Wilson continued, are the ones we'll never hear about. The confrontations that didn't happen. The weapons that stayed holstered. The citizens who went home feeling protected rather than targeted. Agent Henderson joined him at the podium, adding his perspective on how the program had evolved. They'd moved beyond just addressing bias. The training now included modules on community engagement, stress management, and cultural competency. What started on Beacon Hill, Henderson said, has become a model for how we can address systemic issues in law enforcement, not through confrontation, but through conversation and commitment to change. The Attorney General announced the next phase, a nationwide mentorship program where officers who'd completed the training would work with departments across the country. Wilson would lead the effort, turning his experience into a roadmap for others. After the ceremony, Wilson found himself surrounded by officers from different states, each sharing their own stories, their own moments of recognition. His daughter ran up, proudly showing him her drawing. A police officer and a citizen shaking hands, a simple but powerful image of what they were working toward. "You've started something remarkable," Henderson said as they watched the crowd disperse. "But you know the work isn't finished." Wilson nodded, thinking about all the officers still on patrol, all the split-second decisions being made every day. "It's just the beginning," he replied. "But at least now we know change is possible." As they left the building, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Wilson's phone buzzed with messages from officers around the country, asking when the program would reach their departments. His wife joined them, their daughter still clutching her drawing. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Wilson looked back at the training center, then at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, officers were starting their evening shifts, carrying with them the potential for both mistake and redemption. "Yeah," he said, "but tomorrow we start again. There are more stories to tell, more changes to make." The Beacon Hill incident would always be part of his story, but it was no longer the whole story. It had become something larger, a reminder that even our worst moments can lead to our best contributions if we're willing to learn from them. As they drove home through the darkening city, Wilson thought about all the officers who would go through the program in the years to come. Each one would carry a piece of that morning on Beacon Hill with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as a promise that change was possible, one decision at a time. The story that began with a moment of fear and bias had transformed into a legacy of learning and growth. And while this chapter was ending, the real work, the daily commitment to being better, doing better, and teaching others to do the same, would continue long after the headlines faded and the cameras stopped rolling.